Hello, and welcome to another video about Linux and virtualization. Today I want to talk about Multipass, a really cool and convenient virtualization solution from Canonical. But before we dive in, notice that this video is for Linux machines. I made another video for Windows machines, so if you're using Windows, watch that video. On the other hand, if you already watched the Multipass for Windows video, this one will be very similar. So what is Multipass? Multipass is a tool made by Canonical, which is the company behind Ubuntu, that's intended to get you an instant Ubuntu VM with a single command. As you might know, when you use many popular virtualization solutions such as VirtualBox or QEMU and KVM, usually start with an ISO file, then create a new virtual machine, then use the ISO file to install the operating system on the virtual machine. Now that works great, but the whole process can be quite time-consuming. You need to download the ISO file, then create a new virtual machine, then boot up this virtual machine with the ISO file, install the operating system, create a new user and give it a password, and so on and so forth. And then if you want another version, let's say for example that you already have a virtual machine with the latest LTS version of Ubuntu, which would be 20.04, and then you want a second virtual machine with version 21.04. You would have to do it all over again. And all in all, we're talking about quite a considerable time investment. Multipass lets you achieve basically the same thing, but without most of the overhead. You can get your virtual machines up and running within minutes, with hardly any configuration. It is limited to Ubuntu though, so if you want, for example, a Pop! OS virtual machine, Multipass is probably not the way to go. So, the first thing we're going to do is head over to multipass.run. Here we can download Multipass. And since in this video I'm going to focus on Linux hosts, that's the option I'm going to choose. And we see that we need Snap to install it. Now, if you're using any of the distros on this list, you're going to have Snap out of the box. I'm using Manjaro, so I don't have Snap out of the box, so let's follow the instructions to install it. And installation is really simple. Let's open a terminal and run the installation command. And we also need to enable it. And they recommend to restart the computer, so I'll do that. Okay, I'm back. Let's make sure that we now have Snap installed. And we do, so let's go ahead and install Multipass. And Multipass is installed. Let's go ahead and create a virtual machine. The first time we run this command, it has to retrieve the image, so it's going to take about a minute. And once the image is retrieved, the virtual machine is created. And it's done. We now have an Ubuntu VM running inside our Manjaro computer. Compared to the process we'd have to go through to achieve the same thing in VirtualBox or KVM, it's blazing fast, mind-blowing. I had to write literally 2 words, and within 2 minutes, I have a virtual machine up and running. We can get a little cheat sheet for Multipass by just typing Multipass. And we can see the main things we can do. So, for example, here is launch, which is what we just used to launch a new virtual machine. We then have start, to start an instance, stop, and some other stuff. To list our virtual machines, we can run multipass list. And we can see that we currently only have one virtual machine. By the way, landing needlefish is the name of the virtual machine. Multipass auto-generates the name when we launch the machine, and extremely creatively at that, might I say. But as we will see in a minute, we can also name the machines ourselves. Multipass has 2 built-in options to interact with its virtual machines. The first option is the exec command. The exec command lets us run a single command in the virtual machine. So, for example, I'll use it to update my repositories. and we can see the output from the virtual machine. We can also, for example, see which version of Ubuntu the virtual machine is running. And we can see that it's Ubuntu 20.04, the latest LTS version. The other option to interact with our virtual machine is the shell command. And as we can see, we now logged in to the virtual machine, very similar to what we get when we SSH a remote server. The virtual machine came with a Linux user, the one that's in use right now, and it's called Ubuntu. And while I'm here, let me upgrade my system. And we can see that even though I used sudo, I didn't have to type in my password. And that's because the Ubuntu default user doesn't have any password. One of the most convenient features of Multipass is the ability to easily share files between the host and the Ubuntu guest. Let's create a file on the Manjaro host. We can easily copy this file to the virtual machine with the Multipass transfer command. Here we can see the transfer command. And let's see this file on the virtual machine. We can also mount a folder, so we'll have access to it from both the host and the guest. Let's create a shared folder on the guest. And now I link the folder I created in the Manjaro host to this folder. And it was mounted. Let's see it in the virtual machine. I can also create files in the virtual machine, and they will be visible to the host. And now we will have this file on the host machine. To see all of the folders we mounted and their destination in the virtual machine, we can use the info command. And here we can see that we mapped one folder, and it's called empty shared on Manjaro and shared with host on the virtual machine. Let's see if our virtual machine is connected to the internet. So it is connected. Let's see its IP address. And we can see that its IP address is 10.128.something. If we'll take a look at the IP address of our host, I'm currently using Wi-Fi. So let's see the IP for the Wi-Fi network. We can see that it is a completely different network. That's because my Manjaro machine got its IP address from the DHCP service on my router, whereas the virtual machine got its IP address from a virtual router within the virtualization environment in my computer. It's called a NAT network, and I made a video about it, which you can find here. Luckily, when we install Multipass, a new network bridge is defined. Let's install the bridge utilities to be able to explore this bridge. And now we can run bridge control show to list the bridges that are currently defined. And we can see that we have one bridge, Multipass QEMU bridge 0. We have a virtual interface in the host that's connected to this bridge. And that is why we see its address here. So we have a bridge. The host is connected to it, as well as the virtual router. This way, the host and the guest can see each other. So if we can ping the virtual machine, Can we also use SSH to access it? And it failed. Permission denied. Let's fix it. First, let's log into the machine using the shell command. Let's change directory to the folder that holds the SSH configuration. The file we want to edit is sshd config. This file configures the SSH daemon, the server. And I'll scroll down until I find the option to enable or disable password authentication. Let's change it to yes. And now let's restart the SSH service so that the new configuration will take effect. Another thing we need to do is create a user with a password, because SSH won't work if the user doesn't have a password. We can add a password to the default Ubuntu user, but I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to create a new user instead. I need to create a password for the user. And fill in the rest of the details. And since I want this user to have sudo permissions, I'm also going to add it to the sudo group. Let's exit the session and see if SSH works now. And of course I use the new user for the SSH. And we logged in through SSH as the new user. We can also use an SSH key instead of a password. To do that, let's generate a new key, which I'm going to do on the host machine. And I want it to be an RSA key. Let's now copy this key to the Ubuntu virtual machine. And it was copied to the Ubuntu virtual machine. Here it is. I'm going to create an SSH folder for my user. And I want to move the key to this folder and rename it to authorized keys. Now that it's done, we will be able to SSH this user in the Linux machine without password. And we didn't use any password and we logged in. Now that I have SSH key authentication, I can turn off password authentication. And let's restart the SSH service again. Great! We can now access this virtual machine with an SSH key, and password authentication is turned off. Let's take a quick look at the specs of this virtual machine. Let's start with the disk size. And we can see that the machine has 4.7 gigabytes, and it is currently using 1.5 of them. It has only one CPU and about 1 gigabyte of RAM. Let's see how we can allocate more resources to our virtual machine. If we take a look at the Multipass documentation, we can see that we can use -C, -D and -M to set the number of CPUs, disk size, and memory. Let's launch a new virtual machine and make use of these flags. And let's name it Kermit. And let's tap the old virtual machine as we're not going to use it at the moment. And we can see that it's stopped. Let's log in to the new virtual machine, Kermit. Now that we have a significantly more powerful virtual machine and also a bigger virtual drive, why not equip it with a desktop environment? But first, let me create a user with a password like I did in the previous machine. Great. Now I'm going to install TaskCell. It's a small application that's very useful to install popular utilities, including desktops. And let's run TaskCell. Most of the officially supported desktop environments are available here, probably even all of them. I'll go with XFCE as it's pretty lightweight and the installation shouldn't take too long. Since Multipass doesn't have any built-in tool to see the desktop of the virtual machine, we need some remote desktop tool. From a Linux host, it's really simple, since most of the big distros support Remina, which does the job really well. So let's install it on our host. If you're using a Debian-based distro, that's all you need to do for the Remina installation. But in Manjaro, we also need to install FreeRDP. Okay, the desktop installation is done. To allow remote desktop access to the virtual machine, I'm going to install the remote desktop server on it. And now let's try to access it. Since the virtual machine is not connected to a screen, it won't have any native resolution. So we need to set the resolution in Remina itself. Let's open Preferences. And under Screen Resolution, I'll add the resolution of my screen. Now let's create a new connection profile. And let's change the resolution to the new resolution that we defined. And let's connect. And boom! We have a really nice Ubuntu virtual machine with a functional desktop. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.